So hello, I'm Dr. Adam Etinson, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the University of St. Andrews, and I'm here with Professor Elizabeth Anderson as part of the CEPPA Chats series. So thank you very much, Professor Elizabeth Anderson, for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Speaking of esteem, which is a central theme in your Knox lecture, you're certainly someone who I've esteemed in the profession, someone I look up to. So it's a special honor for me to be able to interview you in association with the Knox lecture. So, one of the things that I think distinguishes your work as a philosopher is the breadth of your interests. So you have kind of overarching interest in egalitarianism, but you take that in so many different directions, thinking about education, the workplace, gender relations. Your work just spans so many fields, and in each case you say something empirically very well informed, very interesting. Another one of my favorite philosophers told me that she has this kind of rule of thumb about selecting topics, and it has to be, she said, a what is question. So what is X? How to define X? It has to be a question that is generated by real life experience. It has to be something that is underrepresented in the philosophical literature, which I found very interesting and sort of helped me understand how she selects her topics. And I think for younger philosophers in particular, it's a big question. What do I write about? I'm interested in philosophy, but how do I select my topics? And it's something that's very noteworthy about your work, that you select interesting topics and good topics and topics that engage others. So yeah, I wonder if there are any rules of thumb that you use, maybe implicitly or explicitly, to select the topics that you engage in, that your work discusses.
Well, I'm a pragmatist, and pragmatists believe in choosing philosophical problems that reflect people's problematic experiences. So we start from experience and consider what problems people are having. And they're not necessarily moral and political problems. They could be epistemic problems. How do I know something? Right, I'm worried about things or doubtful. There could be metaphysical problems even, especially if we look at scientists who wonder about the metaphysical status of the objects they're postulating in their theories. But we look to problems that people are encountering in practice, in their experience, and then start philosophizing about that, because often people don't have a clear understanding of what is worrying them. And so pragmatists treasure that moment of coming to articulation of what the problem is, and that requires getting really empirical. Studying people's experiences, drawing on the social sciences that have studied people dealing with their predicaments, and then philosophizing from that. Philosophers then can bring certain kinds of conceptual clarification to what people are experiencing, and think normatively about the social scientific theories that are trying to explain the mechanisms behind people's problematic experiences. And also ask important epistemological questions about those sciences, special sciences, because sometimes they might be making problematic epistemic assumptions or even metaphysical assumptions. So you can bring in philosophy of science and social science to also criticize that, and think about, say, how values are implicated in social scientific and scientific work. And then ask, well, suppose we brought different values to bear on our inquiry, what else would we be discovering? So all of these things are based on engagement with experience, with practice, and with other modes of inquiry outside of philosophy, which raise philosophical questions. And for me, I find it leads to a much more grounded way of doing philosophy. And I think that's really what people find interesting in the way I'm doing philosophy.
Absolutely. There's so many, I suppose, problematic experiences to choose from, though, right? So many things we could look into, like how does it work for you? You think in practice, how does one of them sort of percolate to the point that it becomes, your subject? Is it just that you're sort of keeping your ears and eyes out for sort of what's around you, what's in the news, what's coming from fellow academics, from students, and just seeing what grabs you, or is that how it works?
Sometimes it arises that way, but in certain respects, it just comes from my own experience. So when I first came, my first permanent position is the one I'm still in at University of Michigan. But when I first came there, I was the only woman in the department. And philosophy at that time was also, I'd say, pretty hostile to women. And my problematic experiences of contending with that led me to feminist philosophy, which is, I think, has inherently pragmatist elements to it, because women are kind of trying to figure out their own experiences and what's causing them, and different ways of theorizing what's happening. So some of the problems that I've addressed come from my own experience, but then you think more broadly about the experiences of women in other circumstances, and you can theorize much more broadly. And in a way, thinking about that, and thinking also, my interest in racial inequality also started from experiences at University of Michigan where there was a lot of racism. And that was upsetting, especially Black students, but not only them. And so that got me to thinking. It was a major concern of undergraduates in particular, so I started doing research and teaching about these matters, and then writing about them. And because these are coming from people's experiences, they find philosophical work that's engaging their experiences and helping people make sense of what's going on and what they might do about it compelling.
Yeah, that sounds very, very, very sensible and a natural way to go about it. I'm curious how you found philosophy in the first place, especially like me, I'm someone who was interested in a lot of things.
Yeah.
And philosophy was appealing because I felt, and in some way I didn't have to choose. If I was a philosopher, I could sort of dip in where I liked. Was it something similar for you that drew you to philosophy, or how did that happen that you end up becoming a philosopher of all things?
Yeah. Well, I was already reading philosophy even in high school, which is pretty unusual. But my father was an aeronautical engineer and always missed not having a liberal arts education. And I was reading everything, and my father thought, well, maybe we could read some philosophy together. And so we read Plato, we read John Stuart Mill, and it was a great way to relate to my dad and his interests. That got me interested, but in fact, what I planned to major in when I went to college was economics. And so economics was my thing, and I thought, this is really amazing theory. It's so rigorous and explains stuff. But I was also I also took Introduction to Philosophy, and we read Marx. That was a real experience because, econ wasn't really much dealing with Marx unless you took radical political economy courses. And Marx had a very different perspective on capitalism than what I was getting in Econ 101. And that jarring contrast led me to start questioning some of the normative presuppositions of economics. And there are also some conceptual ambiguities in economic theory that economists themselves were not resolving, which actually have normative implications. For instance, just the assumptions of rational choice, it's a very individualistic model that assumes that whatever you do, you're maximizing your welfare. And that's not really accurate, actually. People do things for all kinds of reasons, not necessarily reasons that are helpful to themselves. So those kinds of questions are the kinds of questions that philosophers ask. So even though I have always remained really deeply interested, not just in economics, but other social sciences, it seemed to me that philosophy was a great place to ask deeper questions about these different social sciences, what their assumptions are, what alternative assumptions might look like, the limitations, both the potential and the limitations of their ways of explaining social phenomena. And philosophy was a great perch from which I could look across a range of social sciences and think about both from a critical angle of their potentials and their limitations, but also draw on the knowledge being produced there for normative purposes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the key ideas or common themes in your work, at least that I've encountered in reading your work over the years, there's a few of them, but one of them seems to me the idea that social identities and social situations can be contrived in such a way to entrap us, to make us unfree. So this comes up in the imperative of integration, and in other places, of course, the Knox lecture, you work on the arrangement and government in the workplace, right? The way that bosses are basically functioning like dictators and things like that. And I suppose what I find interesting is that you paint these situations in a particularly vivid way. You make the sort of nature of these social conditions very, very vivid in your writing in a way that other people don't always. Very plain to the reader. Yeah, I just wondered if there's a particular reason why you think that's true of your writing, why it's true of your sort of philosophical instincts, that you're just sort of good at getting your head and other people's heads into the space of thinking about these identities in a problematic way, or social situations or economic structures. Just inviting you to reflect about that.
Well, I do think in any academic discipline, there's a temptation to get really technical, especially with the vocabulary, and to therefore get kind of esoteric and more distant from human experience. But again, if you're a good pragmatist, you try to be down to earth in your communicative style. And always, whenever you make an abstract claim, always find some concrete illustration rooted in experience that people can relate to. So for me, a big part of my philosophical writing is, if I'm going to make some kind of abstract generalization or theoretical claim, I always immediately go to illustration. So people have a really concrete, clear idea of what I'm talking about. And in general, people are much better with the concrete than with the abstract, and it helps them to understand the more general point when they have one or more cases before them.
Totally, yeah. And I think that's part of what makes reading your work clear. It makes it clear and easily understandable. Something I also urge students to do. Like, anytime you make an abstract claim, it's going to be difficult for the reader to assess it unless you illustrate it with an example right away. So I think that's a very sensible habit. Another common theme is the idea of an expressive wrong or an expressive harm. We were talking about this the other day, but the idea that an action, a law, a policy, an institution can express a certain attitude in the way that it's arranged or the way that it's conducted, apart from its effects or consequences, but express a certain objectionable attitude perhaps towards certain individuals or those subject or those affected by the action in question. And that's going to be an important part of evaluating the action law. It won't be all that matters, but a really important part. And this is a common theme in your work that appears often. I found it very useful for my own work because you develop the sort of technicalities of that idea. And I was just curious where that comes from, like where that came from, your sensitivity to that kind of harm or ethical consideration or dimension of moral life or ethical evaluation, where that comes from in your own biography or philosophical reading, or how it found its way into your work and took such a central place in it.
I think a lot of it came from resistance to purely consequentialist ways of thinking about morality, where we just want to have the right states of affairs or the best states of affairs. And that ignores the means by which we achieve those states of affairs and how we treat other people. So my own orientation, really from the start of my professional career, has been to focus rather on the quality of our relationships to each other as the focus of normative inquiry, and especially of considerations of right and wrong. And that originally was grounded in a study of Kant. So Kantian morality, really almost the paradigm of a non-consequentialist view, is very, very focused on the question of respectful treatment of one another and what the demands of respect are. And that can't be reduced to producing, good states of affairs in the world. So Kant, I think, is already implicitly interested in the expressive dimension, what attitudes we're expressing towards each other. But in fact, you can see that it's already there in 18th century moral thinking. Rousseau and Adam Smith think really the core and origins of morality is people demanding a level of respect and consideration from other people, which is quite separable from the actual degree of material injury they might have suffered at another person's hands. Adam Smith famously says, what mainly enrages us about someone wronging us isn't the material harm, but the low consideration they give, as if we could just, that we're just, it's the arrogance, right?
Yeah.
That they don't have to pay any attention to us. We're so far beneath them that they don't have to constrain their impulses or desires out of a regard for our own interests. It's that attitude that enrages us much more than the material injury, which might be, in fact, trifling.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of it as, I guess Kant would be the sort of principal culprit, people might think, but it's interesting to think about it as an idea that's important to Smith and others like Rousseau. So hopping on to, so I know now you're working on this big, potentially never-ending project on the history of equality, and obviously a very ambitious and exciting project. So I know it's ongoing, right? But I was just curious if you think, the Knox lecture is focusing particularly on a kind of challenge or a set of challenges that present themselves to the egalitarian project. But I wonder, given that the project's ongoing, if you feel like there's a kind of thesis emerging on the horizon for you, like, do you think, are you coming to think perhaps that like the forces that move us towards egalitarianism, and the forces that sort of pull us away from it are equally strong. Are the forces towards domination and hierarchy stronger, more persistent than the others, and so we need to make extra effort to overcome them? Or is it a draw, in some sense, totally up to us in our social engineering? Is there kind of an emerging sociological, political conclusion that's forming for you at this point?
Well, I do think that even under modern conditions, we're capable of creating a society of equals. So I have a basic optimism about that. But I also think we need to be realistic about the obstacles, especially since we're not living in a society of equals. Even in the more egalitarian societies, we still have really problematic inequalities. So we have our work cut out for us. At the same time, I'm pretty convinced that inequality is a product of ideologies which are deceptive and fraudulent in various ways, and that it's possible to inspire people to a better vision of the world, which will actually create a society that's better for everybody. It can be something of a hard haul, but one of my missions in doing this work is to develop what you might call an egalitarian toolbox, like a whole bunch of different strategies that could overcome entrenched ways of thinking, feelings that if you let some subordinate group rise, somehow it's going to be at your expense. I think that's just wrong. We can all gain from a more equal society. And to make that vivid to people will reduce the grip of inegalitarian ideologies. So for me, I strongly believe that we're not just the prisoners of our material circumstances or our modes of production. Ideas really matter. Yeah. How we think about our lives, about what matters, that matters. And that's why, right, not just academics, but people more generally are impelled to philosophize, engage in moral, political reflection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so on that note, one of the key takeaways of the Knox lecture, I take it, is that if egalitarianism is going to work, we've got to figure out a way of creating an egalitarian economy of esteem, right? Like a society where everyone can feel respected, admired, esteemed, in some sense, where that doesn't have to mean, as you put it, sort of thinking of esteem in zero-sum terms, whereby, my respect comes at the expense of someone else's respect, where, they'll have to be put down in order for me to be raised up. And you say at the end of the lecture that it's sort of the job of poets and artists and writers to imagine how this is going to work and to do, I suppose, the culture work of actually making this possible. But yeah, I just wondered, so you talk about a toolkit for egalitarians, and then there's the question of also the vision of what it would look like. But I was wondering if, the solution is something like, I imagine it is something like what we see in countries like Scandinavia, where it seems like the esteem gap between so-called white-collar and blue-collar jobs is much less than in other countries. Like someone delivering the mail or driving the bus is not looked at any differently than someone, walking into a financial institution office in a business suit or something like that. These are all seen as equal players. Or the person cleaning up the office is no less than the person working at the office desk or something like that. I imagine that's the kind of vision you're looking for. Is it about universalizing that sort of across all sectors of the economy, of society, and using our imagination to get there, and sort of the means of cultural production to get there. Yeah, just trying to draw out a little bit more of...
Right. So it might be a little bit of an exaggeration to assume that places like Sweden and Norway have that much egalitarianism. However, but it's better than the United States for sure.
It's tending in the right direction.
Yeah. But we should also consider that one of the reasons for the relatively larger egalitarianism of esteem in these countries is also that they're more democratic, and they are more there's more equal distribution of income and wealth. So notoriously, people esteem the mere possession of power and wealth. Even though, from a philosophical point of view, if you really think about it hard, mere possession can't possibly be admirable in itself. I mean, that's just something that, you might have inherited. Why should that make you worthy of esteem? It's kind of silly. But because we do have this tendency, if people are more equal on these dimensions, they'll also be more equal in esteem. So that gives us a little tool, though, and that is empowering workers, for instance, blue-collar workers at workplaces, will in fact enable them to enjoy a share of esteem as well. You can't just trample on them, right? Because they have a voice in the workplace. And indeed, that applies at all ranks of workers. I happen to know an engineer who worked as an engineer both in the United States and in Germany, where Germany has famously a system of co-determination where the management authority is held jointly by workers and by representatives of the owners. And I asked him what it was like to work in an engineering firm with co-determination, where all the workers at all ranks, engineers and various other staff people, they all have a voice in how the firm is managed and how day-to-day operations goes. Yeah. And he said, for the first time in life, I realized what being respected as a worker really meant. And here's an engineer who we think, like in the US context, is a pretty high status worker. But in fact, such workers are also manipulated and jerked around in American corporations. But engineers in Germany didn't have to put up with that.
So we can get social equality through political equality, and that's one of our tools. Yeah. I think that's a good place to finish. So thank you very much for joining us and for taking the time.
No, it was fun. Thanks.